The date was June 17, 1972, a night where the thick, oppressive humidity of Washington, D.C. seemed to cling to the marble monuments like a shroud, hiding the brutal truth of what was about to unfold within the city's corridors of power. Most of the nation was asleep, unaware that the American dream was about to face its most harrowing nightmare, a secret war that would expose the dark underbelly of the elite. At the Watergate office complex, a shimmering curved fortress of glass and concrete that stood as a symbol of modern dominance, the silence was broken only by the rhythmic footsteps of a 24-year-old security guard named Frank Wills. This young man, an ordinary American worker, was about to stumble upon a mystery that would trigger the most shocking facts in political history. As Wills made his rounds, he noticed something seemingly insignificant: a piece of duct tape placed over the latch of a basement door to prevent it from locking. He removed it, thinking it a minor oversight by a janitor, but when he returned 30 minutes later, the tape was back. This wasn't a mistake. It was an invitation into a hidden history. The guard's heart hammered against his ribs as he realized this was no ordinary burglary. It was an undisclosed operation by a group of professionals who moved through the shadows with the precision of an assassin. When the police arrived, not the uniformed patrolmen one might expect, but a bum squad of plainclothes officers in a beat-up car to avoid detection, they found 5 men inside the 6th floor headquarters of the Democratic National Committee. These were not desperate street criminals. They wore expensive business suits and surgical dyed gloves, carrying sophisticated bugging equipment, walkie-talkies, and thousands of dollars in crisp, sequentially numbered $100 bills. This was a legendary blunder that would change everything. Among the arrested was James McCord, a man whose resume was a black file of intelligence work, a former CIA officer and the current security coordinator for the committee to re-elect the president. The truth behind their presence was far more sinister than a simple theft. They weren't there for jewels or cash. They were there to steal information, to plant bugs, and to ensure the total dominance of the Nixon administration by spying on their political rivals. This was the art of war applied to domestic politics, a taboo violation of the very democratic principles the nation claimed to uphold. As the news broke the following morning, the White House shifted into a mode of aggressive dismissiveness. Press Secretary Ron Ziegler, with a confident smile that masked a growing panic, famously labeled the incident a third-rate burglary, an essential piece of propaganda designed to bury the story before it could breathe. He urged the press not to look closer, a warning that only served to pique the curiosity of those who sensed a deeper legend at play. The administration acted as if the event were ancient history before it even made the front page, but the reality was a shocking conspiracy that reached into the very heart of the Oval Office. Did you know that at that very moment, the architects of this plot were already moving to destroy evidence and silence witnesses? The missing links in the story were being intentionally erased, creating an unsolved mystery that the public was never supposed to decode. This was the start of a recreated reality where the line between law and power became dangerously blurred. The Watergate break-in was the first crack in the dam, a forbidden glimpse into a world of hidden history where the rules of the game were written in invisible ink. As we rewind the tapes of history, we see a nation at a crossroads, caught between the idealized past and a future defined by systemic distrust. This true story isn't just about 5 burglars in a dark office. It is about the fragile nature of the republic and the lengths to which an empire will go to protect its throne. The men in suits were just the foot soldiers in a much larger, more terrifying campaign of sabotage and surveillance. The mystery of why they were really there and who exactly sent them remained a guarded secret, a puzzle waiting for the right minds to solve. As the sun rose over the Potomac, the Watergate building stood silent, but the echoes of that night were already beginning to vibrate through the halls of Congress, threatening to bring down the most powerful man in the world. This was the brutal truth that schools often skip, a narrative of human drama where ambition turned into paranoia and loyalty became a death sentence for careers. The shadows at the Watergate were lengthening, reaching out to touch everyone from the lowest staffer to the president himself, setting the stage for a constitutional crisis that would nearly destroy America. To truly decode the mystery of Watergate, we must first descend into the psychological labyrinth of the man at the center of the storm. Richard Nixon, a figure whose reign was defined by a relentless quest for dominance and a deep-seated fear of the shadows. The brutal truth that textbooks often ignore is that the Watergate break-in was not an isolated mistake. It was the inevitable climax of a secret war that Nixon had been waging against his perceived enemies for years. This hidden history begins with the enemies list, a forbidden document of political targets ranging from actors to journalists, all categorized as threats to the empire. Nixon did not see himself as just a president. He saw himself as a commander in a high-stakes battle for the soul of America, where any means justified the preservation of his power. The atmosphere within the White House was thick with a culture of surveillance, a shocking reality where loyalty was measured by one's willingness to operate in the dark. The catalyst for the administration's descent into madness was the 1971 leak of the Pentagon Papers by Daniel Ellsberg, a move that exposed decades of government lies regarding the Vietnam War. Tudor. Nixon, this was more than a leak. It was a betrayal of the highest order, a crack in the fortress of national security that required a ruthless response. In the frantic aftermath, the administration created the Special Investigations Unit, a group that would become legendary under the name the Plumbers. Their mission was simple but terrifying: to stop leaks and destroy the reputation of anyone who dared to speak the truth. This was a black file operation, hidden from the eyes of Congress and the public, funded by a secret slush fund and led by men who treated domestic politics like a battlefield. Among these architects of paranoia were G. Gordon Liddy, a man obsessed with the art of war and the concept of total control, and E. Howard Hunt, a former CIA operative who moved through the corridors of power like a professional assassin. Together, they orchestrated the first major taboo violation of the Nixon era, the break-in at the office of Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist. Their goal was not to find evidence of a crime, but to find dirt, to uncover the most private secrets of a man's mind to use as a weapon against him. This was the shocking truth of how the elite used their influence to crush dissent, a warning of what happens when the line between national security and personal vengeance disappears. The visual landscape of this era was one of high contrast and cinematic lighting, where the gold of the Oval Office's prestige clashed with the deep red of political drama and the dark brown of buried secrets. Nixon was often depicted in these moments not as a leader, but as a man caught in a cold blue courtroom of his own making, surrounded by the ghosts of his predecessors and the growing weight of his own lies. He was an ordinary American worker who had risen to the pinnacle of power, only to be consumed by the very system he sought to master. The Plumbers were the foot soldiers of this empire, operating with an undisclosed mandate that bypassed every constitutional check and balance. They utilized sophisticated bugging technology and psychological warfare to ensure the dominance of the administration, turning the White House into a command center for a surveillance state. Did you know that Nixon's obsession with control led him to record every conversation that took place in the Oval Office, creating a literal archive of his own paranoia? He believed these tapes would be his legacy, a testament to his brilliance, but they were actually a ticking time bomb, a mystery waiting to be decoded by future generations. The narrative of the Watergate architects is a true story of how fear can corrupt even the most intelligent minds, leading them to abandon the law in favor of a recreated reality where the ends always justified the means. As we rewind the tapes of history, we see a man who was terrified of the very people he was meant to lead, a leader who felt more at home in the shadows than in the light of transparency. This is the hidden history of the architects of paranoia, a group that believed they were protecting the nation while they were actually dismantling its foundations from within. Their actions were a warning to the future, a brutal truth about the fragility of democracy and the dangerous allure of absolute power. The Plumbers and their masters in the Oval Office were not just playing politics, they were waging a war of information, a secret campaign of sabotage that would eventually lead them to the doors of the Watergate complex. Every wiretap, every stolen document, and every silenced witness was a step toward the ultimate fall, a legendary collapse that would leave the nation scarred and suspicious of the very halls of power. This part of the story is essential to understanding why the break-in happened. It was the final desperate act of a group that had already crossed the line into criminality long before they ever set foot in the DNC headquarters. The architects of Paranoia had built a house of cards, and the wind of the truth was beginning to blow through the cracks in their fortress. They had forgotten the most important lesson of American history, that in a republic, the truth cannot be suppressed forever, and the power belongs to the people, not the men in the shadows. This is the narrative of an empire in decline, a shocking facts-driven account of how the pursuit of dominance can turn a dream into a nightmare, setting the stage for the most explosive political scandal in history. The sun rose over the Potomac on June 18, 1972, casting long, dramatic shadows across the White House lawn, but inside the Oval Office, the atmosphere was far from the golden glow of presidential prestige. It was a cold, high-contrast landscape of panic and frantic calculation. This is the true story of how an elite group of men, driven by a desperate need for dominance, began weaving a web of deceit that would eventually entangle the entire American government. The brutal truth is that the third-rate burglary was merely the tip of a massive hidden history of corruption. Within hours of the arrests, the architects of Paranoia transitioned into the masters of the cover-up, initiating a secret war against the truth itself. The missing links in the narrative were not accidental. They were the result of an essential and calculated effort to erase the black files of the Nixon administration. This was the art of war applied to the legal system, a shocking facts-driven campaign to ensure that the investigation into the Watergate break-in hit a dead end before it could reach the inner sanctum of power. The first move in this legendary chess match was the destruction of evidence. While the nation went about its business, a taboo ritual was taking place in the homes and offices of the president's men, the burning of documents. Jeb Magruder, a high-ranking official, watched as his own involvement was reduced to ash in his fireplace, a literal purging of the truth to protect the empire. But the most shocking part of this unsolved mystery was the manipulation of the nation's premier intelligence and law enforcement agencies. In a recreated reality where national security was used as a shield for criminality, H.R. Haldeman and John Ehrlichman, Nixon's most loyal protectors, hatched a plan to use the CIA to blind the FBI. They pressured the CIA to tell the FBI that the Watergate probe would interfere with a secret operation in Mexico, effectively using the cloak of the forbidden to stop a legitimate criminal inquiry. This was a brutal violation of the separation of powers, a warning of how easily the elite can bend the law to their will. As the investigation threatened to expose the financial trail, the administration turned to their secret weapon, hush money. Using a legendary slush fund of hundreds of thousands of dollars in untraceable cash, they began paying off the 5 burglars and their handlers. This wasn't just a bribe, it was a contract for silence, an attempt to buy the loyalty of men who moved like assassins in the political shadows. Each payment was a gamble, a desperate attempt to keep the truth behind the curtain for just a little longer. The cinematic lighting of this era often highlights the tension of these moments. Late-night meetings in dark newsrooms or shadowy parking garages where the stakes were nothing, less than the survival of the presidency. Did you know that the total amount of hush money distributed exceeded $450,000, a staggering sum for the time, intended to ensure that the legend of the third-rate burglary remained the official narrative? But money was only half the battle. The other half was perjury. Under the direction of the White House, Officials lied under oath, creating a decoded language of deception designed to mislead grand juries and the American public. They transformed the courtroom into a stage for a grand performance, where the truth was a casualty of political survival. This hidden history of the cover-up reveals a shocking truth about the fragility of democracy when the men in power decide that they are the law. The Web of Deceit was not just a series of lies. It was a systemic dismantling of the truth-seeking mechanisms of the state. Every time an FBI agent was told to back off, or a witness was coached to forget, the American system of justice suffered a brutal blow. This part of the Watergate saga is a forgotten tale of moral collapse, where the desire for power and dominance overruled every ethical boundary. As we rewind the tapes of this era, we see a presidency that had become an empire of its own making, isolated from the very people it was supposed to serve. The shocking facts of the cover-up show that the administration was more afraid of the truth than they were of the crime itself. They believed they could manage the mystery, that they could keep the black files closed forever. But the web they were weaving was becoming too large, too heavy with the weight of its own contradictions. The navy blue authority of the government was being stained by the deep, red drama of a criminal conspiracy. This was a warning to future generations. When the elite believe their power is absolute, the truth becomes their greatest enemy. The Web of Deceit was designed to be a fortress, but it was actually a trap, one that would eventually ensnare the very men who built it. As the cover-up deepened, the distance between the public image of the Nixon administration and the brutal reality of their actions became a chasm. They were living in a recreated reality, one that would eventually be shattered by the persistence of the few who refused to accept the official lie. The story of the Watergate cover-up is an essential chapter in the history of the United States, a true story of how close a nation can come to the brink of institutional destruction when its leaders abandon the light of transparency for the safety of the shadows. The mystery of Watergate was no longer just about who broke in. It was now about how far the president would go to hide the truth. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test every fiber of the American legal system, a battle for the soul of the nation that started with a simple piece of tape and ended with the collapse of an empire. While the Nixon administration was busy weaving its elaborate web of deceit, a parallel narrative was beginning to stir in the dimly lit, smoke-filled corners of the Washington Post newsroom, where the clacking of typewriters formed the rhythmic heartbeat of a different kind of power. This is the true story of the Voices in the Dark, a chapter of hidden history where two young, relatively unknown reporters became the primary threat to the most powerful empire on Earth. Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein were the embodiment of the investigative journalist archetype: focused, intense eyes, rolled sleeves, and desks cluttered with parchment papers and coffee-stained notes. They were ordinary American workers in the world of media, yet they were about to decode a mystery that the elite had spent millions to keep hidden. The brutal truth is that while the rest of the nation was ready to accept the third-rate burglary narrative, these two felt a sense of shocking facts lurking beneath the surface. Their journey into the black files of the Watergate scandal began not with a grand revelation, but with a series of missing links and a $25,000 check that had mysteriously found its way into the bank account of one of the burglars. This was the financial fingerprint of a secret war, a warning that the break-in was funded by the very people sworn to uphold the law. As they followed the money, they encountered a wall of silence, a taboo atmosphere where sources were terrified to speak, and the White House utilized its navy blue authority to intimidate anyone who dared to question the official legend. But in the deepest shadows of a suburban parking garage, a mystery figure emerged to guide them through the labyrinth. Known only by the legendary pseudonym Deep Throat, this undisclosed source provided the breadcrumbs necessary to dismantle the cover-up. In meetings defined by cinematic lighting and moody, dark backgrounds, Deep Throat offered a simple but essential piece of advice: follow the money. This was the key to unlocking the unsolved mystery, the cipher that would allow Woodward and Bernstein to see the art of war being played out in American politics. The shocking truth they uncovered was that the Watergate break-in was just one part of a much larger, more terrifying campaign of political sabotage and surveillance directed from the highest levels of the government. Did you know that the reporters faced immense pressure not just from the government, but from their own industry, as many dismissed their work as a partisan witch hunt? Yet they persisted, fueled by a desire for the truth and a refusal to allow the empire to dictate the narrative. Their reporting was a masterclass in decoding the language of power, exposing how the elite used their dominance to crush dissent and subvert the democratic process. The visual identity of this part of our story is one of high contrast. The bright, fluorescent lights of the newsroom clashing with the cold, dark blue of the secret meetings that occurred in the dead of night. Woodward and Bernstein were not just writing articles. They were reconstructing a recreated reality, piece by agonizing piece, until the brutal truth could no longer be ignored. Their work was a warning to the future about the essential role of a free press in a republic, a reminder that the truth is the only weapon strong enough to bring down a corrupt empire. Every story they published was a blow to the administration's web of deceit, a crack in the fortress of the Oval Office that allowed the light of transparency to seep in. The mystery of Deep Throat's identity remained a guarded secret for decades, adding to the legendary status of their investigation and proving that even in a world of total surveillance, the truth can find a way to emerge. This is the narrative of the Fourth Estate rising to meet its greatest challenge, a true story of courage and persistence in the face of overwhelming odds. As we rewind the tapes of this era, we see that the voices in the dark were the first to hear the echoes of the constitutional crisis that was looming on the horizon. They didn't just report the news, they became the architects of a new era of accountability, proving that the pen can indeed be mightier than the sword of an assassin. The hidden history of their investigation reveals the shocking facts of how close the cover-up came to succeeding, and how a few dedicated individuals managed to pull the thread that eventually unraveled the entire conspiracy. This part of the Watergate saga is a forgotten tale of journalistic grit, where the pursuit of the truth became a dangerous game of cat and mouse with the most powerful man in the world. The reporters were often portrayed with dramatic expressions of concern and determination, reflecting the gravity of the situation as they realized they were no longer just chasing a story, but were fighting for the survival of the American system. The mystery of Watergate was expanding, and as Woodward and Bernstein continued to dig, they uncovered a world of bugging, hush money, and political espionage that made the original break-in look like child's play. This was the brutal truth of the Nixon era, a time when the lines between law, politics, and criminality were blurred beyond recognition. The voices in the dark ensured that the American people were no longer kept in the dark, providing the evidence that would eventually force the Senate to launch its own investigation. Their work was the catalyst for everything that followed, the spark that ignited a firestorm of public outrage and legal scrutiny. As we look back on this chapter of American history, we see a nation that was nearly destroyed by a secret war, only to be saved by the persistence of those who refused to let the truth remain an unsolved mystery. This narrative is essential for anyone who wants to understand why Watergate matters today. It is a story of how a free press serves as the final guardrail against the descent into tyranny and the absolute dominance of the elite. The stage was now set for the next phase of the drama, as the voices in the dark grew into a roar that the White House could no longer ignore. By early 1973, the mystery that Woodward and Bernstein had been chasing through the shadows of parking garages and anonymous phone calls finally exploded into the full, harsh glare of the public consciousness, as the United States Senate could no longer ignore the shocking facts surrounding the Watergate break-in. This was the moment the hidden history of the Nixon administration transitioned from a newspaper investigation into a full-scale constitutional showdown played out in the cold blue courtroom atmosphere of the Russell Senate Office Building. The formation of the Senate Watergate Committee, led by the stern, eyebrow-wiggling constitutionalist Sam Ervin, marked a turning point where the navy blue authority of the law finally confronted the secret war being waged from the Oval Office. As the hearings began to be televised, the nation was glued to their screens, witnessing a legendary display of political drama that felt more like a high-stakes thriller than a legislative inquiry. These weren't just politicians asking questions, they were the architects of a new era of accountability, digging through the black files of a corrupt empire to find the brutal truth. The atmosphere in the hearing room was thick with tension, defined by cinematic lighting and the dramatic expressions of witnesses who knew their testimony could either save or sink the presidency. One by one, the elite of the Nixon inner circle were called to testify, but the most shocking facts came from a man who had once been the president's most loyal protector, John Dean. Dean, with his focused, intense eyes and a meticulous memory, became the ultimate whistleblower, an ordinary American worker within the machine who decided to decode the language of the cover-up for the entire world to hear. In a testimony that lasted for days, he spoke of a cancer growing on the presidency, a taboo revelation that exposed the heart of the conspiracy and the personal involvement of Richard Nixon himself. He detailed the hush money, the surveillance, and the art of war that had been used to keep the truth buried, providing a shocking truth that the administration could no longer dismiss as a third-rate burglary. The public felt a sense of engyongang as they realized the depth of the deception, a warning that the very people sworn to protect the Constitution were the ones actively dismantling it. But even after Dean's explosive testimony, it was still his word against the president's, an unsolved mystery of he said, she said, that left the nation divided. That was until July 16, 1973, when a relatively unknown White House staffer named Alexander Butterfield was called to the stand. In a moment of cinematic drama that would change American history forever, Butterfield was asked a simple question about how the president could remember his conversations with such precision. His response was a bombshell that shattered the walls of the secret fortress, the existence of a secret taping system in the Oval Office. Did you know that Butterfield's disclosure was an essential piece of the puzzle that no one, not even the most seasoned investigators, had seen coming? This was the ultimate missing link, the secret key that would allow the world to hear the raw, unedited, brutal truth of what happened behind closed doors. The revelation that Nixon had recorded every word spoken in his presence was a legend-making moment, transforming the investigation into a race for the tapes. The gold of the Oval Office's prestige was now overshadowed by the deep red drama of a criminal investigation that had found its smoking gun. The Senate hearings were no longer just an inquiry. They were a battle for the soul of the nation, a quest to uncover the hidden history that had been recorded in secret. The visual identity of this era, the sharp suits, the intense eyes of the senators, and the flickering light of millions of television sets, captured a nation in the midst of a collective awakening. Every day brought new shocking facts, new forgotten tales of political sabotage that made the original break-in look like just the beginning. This was the decoded truth that the elite had tried to suppress, now being broadcast into every living room in America. The mystery of Watergate was unraveling in real time, proving that even an empire built on dominance and paranoia cannot survive the light of transparency. The Senate had erupted, and the shockwaves were heading straight for the most powerful office in the world, setting the stage for a legal battle that would test the very limits of the American system. The revelation of the secret Oval Office taping system was like a lightning bolt striking the very foundation of the American presidency, transforming the Watergate mystery from a political scandal into a high-stakes constitutional war over the ultimate black file of the 20th century. This was the moment the hidden history of the Nixon administration was no longer just a matter of testimony or journalistic investigation. It was now a physical reality, captured on hundreds of reels of magnetic tape hidden within the walls of the most powerful office on Earth. To Richard Nixon, these tapes were his private sanctuary, a legendary archive of his dominance and strategic brilliance, but to the American people, they represented the missing link to the brutal truth. The battle for the tapes was not merely a legal dispute, it was a struggle for the soul of the Republic. a test of whether the President of the United States stood above the law or was subject to its navy blue authority. As the special prosecutor Archibald Cox, a man of unwavering integrity and sharp, serious eyes, issued a subpoena for the recordings, the White House responded by retreating into a fortress of executive privilege. This was the ultimate taboo violation in the eyes of the administration. An outside investigator demanding access to the president's most confidential conversations. Nixon, depicted in this era with a stern, determined face and cinematic lighting that cast deep shadows across his brow, argued that the principle of separation of powers gave him the absolute right to keep his records secret. He claimed that the very functioning of the empire depended on the ability of a leader to speak candidly without fear of future disclosure. This was a sophisticated art of war maneuver, an attempt to use the Constitution itself as a shield to protect a criminal. Conspiracy. The nation watched with a sense of shocking facts unfolding daily as the legal tug-of-war moved through the courts, raising questions that schools often skip. Does the president have the power to suppress evidence of a crime in the fall? Name of national security? Is executive privilege an absolute shield or a limited protection? The mystery deepened as Nixon offered a recreated reality known as the Stennis Compromise, suggesting that a nearly deaf senator, John Stennis, should listen to the tapes and provide edited summaries instead of releasing the actual recordings. This was a classic piece of political propaganda, a decoded attempt to keep the forbidden truth behind a veil of controlled information. Cox, however, refused to blink, insisting that in a court of law, only the raw evidence would suffice. This refusal set the stage for one of the most intense human dramas in American history, as the president found himself cornered by the very technology he had installed to secure his legacy. The visual identity of this part of the saga is defined by high contrast, the shimmering gold of the Oval Office clashing with the cold blue of the courtroom and the dark brown of the archives where the tapes were stored. Every legal filing was a blow to the administration's web of deceit, a crack in the fortress of the elite that threatened to expose the shocking truth of the cover-up. Did you know that the tapes didn't just record meetings? They captured the raw paranoia and the ruthless calculations of men who treated the United States like a chessboard for their own dominance. The battle for the tapes was an essential chapter in the history of the United States because it forced the Supreme Court to define the limits of presidential power for the first time in a century. It was a warning to all future leaders that the law is a legendary force that cannot be ignored, even by the most powerful man in the world. As the case of United States versus Nixon wound its way toward the highest court in the land, the atmosphere in Washington was one of tense anticipation, a feeling of being on the brink of an unsolved mystery that would finally be decoded. The public's curiosity was at an all-time high, fueled by the FOMO of missing out on the most explosive audio recordings in history. These tapes were more than just evidence. They were a true story of an empire in decline, a narrative of how the pursuit of total control can lead to a total collapse. The battle was no longer just about Watergate. It was about the fundamental principle that in America, the truth belongs to the people, not to the men in the shadows. The struggle for the recordings was a masterclass in the persistence of the legal system, showing that even when the elite use their power to intimidate and stall, the gears of justice continue to turn. Every day the tapes remained hidden was a day the shadow over the presidency grew longer, casting a shroud of doubt over the entire government. The voices in the dark had now been replaced by the silent, spinning reels of the Oval Office, waiting for the moment when their undisclosed secrets would finally be heard by the world. This was the brutal truth of the battle for the tapes, a journey into the black files of power, where the stakes were nothing less than the survival of the American system of government. As we rewind the tapes of this era, we see a nation that was terrified of what it might find, yet determined to see the investigation through to its end. The tapes were the ultimate mystery, a legendary puzzle that would eventually provide the smoking gun necessary to bring the drama to its final, shocking conclusion. The battle was about to move from the corridors of the White House to the marble halls of the Supreme Court, setting the stage for a showdown that would redefine the American presidency forever. October 20th, 1973, remains etched in the collective memory of the United States as a night of political carnage, a brutal truth that shook the very foundations of the American legal system and exposed the hidden history of an administration willing to burn the house down to protect its secrets. As the cool autumn air settled over the Potomac, a secret war within the government reached its boiling point, transforming the Watergate mystery into a visceral human drama of integrity versus absolute dominance. The catalyst was Richard Nixon's desperate, high-stakes gamble to stop the momentum of the special prosecutor Archibald Cox, who had become a living embodiment of the navy blue authority that the president so feared. Cox, with his sharp, serious eyes and unyielding commitment to the law, had refused to accept the Stennis Compromise, a move Nixon viewed as a direct challenge to his empire. In a legendary televised press conference earlier that day, Cox had stood before the nation to explain why the president's offer was an essential violation of the subpoena process, essentially decoding the administration's attempt to keep the black files of the Oval Office tapes hidden from justice. Nixon, consumed by paranoia and a perceived need for total control, decided it was time for a professional political assassin to strike at the heart of the investigation. He issued a direct order to Attorney General Elliot Richardson: fire Archibald Cox. This command triggered a series of shocking facts that schools often skip, a domino effect of resignations that demonstrated the fragility of power when faced with personal principle. Richardson, a man who valued the parchment of the Constitution over the gold of political favor, refused to obey, a command that violated his oath of office. With a stern, determined face and a heavy heart, he handed in his resignation, refusing to be a tool for Nixon's dominance. The president, unfazed and increasingly isolated in a recreated reality where he was above the law, then turned to the Deputy Attorney General, William Ruckelshaus. Again, the answer was a resounding no. Ruckelshaus joined the ranks of the resigned, leaving the Department of Justice in a state of unprecedented chaos. The visual landscape of that night was one of high contrast and dramatic lighting, as the White House became a dark, moody fortress surrounded by the metaphorical smoke of a constitutional battlefield. Finally, the president reached Robert Bork, the Solicitor General, who, believing that the Department of Justice needed to remain functional, carried out the firing. The Saturday Night Massacre was complete, but the victory for Nixon was a hollow legend. The brutal truth of his overreach was now undeniable, a warning to the entire nation that the executive branch had declared war on the rule of law. The public's reaction was a shocking, facts-driven firestorm. Nearly 500,000 telegrams flooded into Washington, a roar of outrage from the ordinary American worker who felt the system was being stolen from them. This was a decoded moment of clarity for the public, an essential realization that the mystery of Watergate was no longer just about a break-in, but about the survival of democracy itself. The elite had finally pushed too far, and the resulting backlash was a taboo-breaking call for impeachment that echoed through the halls of Congress. Did you know that the FBI was ordered to seal off the offices of the special prosecutor that very night? A move that felt like a scene from an empire in decline, where the secret police are used to silence dissent. The Saturday Night Massacre transformed the narrative into a true story of moral courage versus systemic corruption, highlighting the deep red drama of a presidency unraveling in real time. As we rewind the tapes of this era, we see that Nixon's attempt to crush the investigation only succeeded in making the truth more inevitable. He had unintentionally created a legendary precedent of resistance, proving that the navy blue authority of the law cannot be fired by the whim of a single man. The hidden history of the Justice Department's bum squad and the frantic phone calls in the dark newsrooms of D.C. captures the essence of a nation at a crossroads. Every resignation was a blow to the administration's web of deceit, a crack in the ivory tower that allowed the cold light of accountability to finally pour in. The Saturday Night Massacre remains a chilling warning of what happens when a leader prioritizes personal vengeance over the essential duties of his office. It was a night when the art of war was turned inward, nearly destroying the American trust in government, and setting the stage for the final legendary collapse of the Nixon era. The mystery was no longer a matter of if the truth would come out, but how much damage would be done before it did. This part of the Watergate saga is a forgotten tale of institutional resilience, where the system's guardrails were tested to their absolute limit by a man obsessed with his own dominance. The cinematic lighting of history shines brightest on those who stood their ground that night, proving that even in the shadows of a corrupt empire, the voices of integrity can still be heard. Nixon believed he had decapitated the investigation, but he had actually ignited a fuse that would lead directly to his own downfall, a shocking truth that would eventually be decoded by the very people he sought to master. The battle for the soul of America was far from over, but the lines were now drawn in the deep red ink of a constitutional crisis that would redefine the nation for generations to come. The tension in Washington, D.C. had reached a fever pitch by the summer of 1974, as the battle for the soul of the nation moved from the chaotic newsrooms and smoke-filled backrooms to the silent marble sanctuary of the Supreme Court of the United States. This was the true story of a legal showdown that would define the limits of an empire and prove once and for all that, in a republic, the navy blue authority of the law is absolute. The hidden history of United States versus Nixon is a narrative of immense human drama, where the elite circle of the presidency finally collided with the cold, unyielding power of the judiciary. After the brutal truth of the Saturday Night Massacre, a new special prosecutor, Leon Jaworski, had taken up the sword of justice, demanding the release of 64 additional tape recordings from the Oval Office. Nixon, depicted in this era with a stern, determined face and sharp, serious eyes, continued to hide behind the black files of executive privilege, a concept he treated as a forbidden shield against any form of accountability. He believed that as the leader of the American empire, his need for secrecy was legendary and trumped the requirements of the legal system. The visual landscape of this confrontation was one of high contrast, the majestic gold and cream of the Supreme Court's interior clashing with the dark brown weight of historical precedent and the deep red drama of a presidency on the brink of collapse. As the case reached the highest court in the land, the mystery wasn't just about the tapes themselves, but about whether the American system of checks and balances would hold firm against a man obsessed with dominance. On July 8, 1974, the justices gathered in an old courtroom background that felt like a cold blue sanctuary of truth, ready to decode one of the most essential questions in the history of the United States. Did you know that the Chief Justice, Warren Burger, had actually been appointed by Nixon himself, leading many to believe that the president might have a secret ally on the bench? This created an atmosphere of intense FOMO for the public, who waited for any disclosure of how the court would rule on this taboo violation of presidential power. The shocking facts of the case were laid bare. The president's lawyers argued for an absolute privilege that was undisclosed in the Constitution, while Jaworski argued that such a power would transform the president into a monarch, an ancient history concept that the Founding Fathers had explicitly rejected. The argument was a masterclass in the art of war applied to constitutional law, a battle where every word was a weapon and the stakes were the very survival of democratic principles. For 16 days, the nation lived in a state of suspended animation, a warning of the fragility of the rule of law when challenged by the elite. Then, on July 24, 1974, the court delivered a bombshell that shattered the administration's web of deceit. In a unanimous 8-0 decision, a legendary display of judicial unity, the court ruled that while executive privilege is a valid concept for national security, it is not an absolute shield that can be used to hide evidence in a criminal trial. This was the brutal truth Nixon had feared most. The court declared that even the president is not above the law. The ruling was a decoded message to all future leaders that the power of the office is a trust, not a mandate for dominance. The pardoned justices, shown with expressive faces of gravity and concern, had essentially stripped away the gold of Nixon's prestige, leaving him exposed to the shocking truth contained within his own recordings. This was a recreated reality for the Nixon administration, one where their sophisticated bugging technology was now being turned against them by the very system they sought to master. The mystery of the tapes was about to be solved, and the missing links in the Watergate conspiracy were finally within reach of the investigators. The Supreme Court showdown was an essential turning point because it proved that the American system has a self-correcting mechanism, a legendary guardrail that prevents the descent into tyranny. Every ordinary American worker who had felt a sense of systemic distrust now saw that the navy blue authority of the law could indeed hold the most powerful man in the world accountable. The visual identity of the ruling was one of cinematic lighting, a bright, cold light of transparency shining into the dark corners of the Oval Office. The Supreme Court had spoken, and the echoes of their decision were a warning to any empire that forgets its foundations. This true story of judicial courage is a forgotten tale of how the law can be the ultimate equalizer, a cipher that breaks the code of corruption and restores the balance of power. Nixon was ordered to turn over the tapes immediately, a mandate that left him with no more undisclosed secrets to hide behind. The battle for the recordings had ended in a total defeat for the architects of Paranoia, setting the stage for the final shocking discovery of the smoking gun. As we rewind the tapes of this era, we see that the Supreme Court showdown was not just a legal victory, it was a moral one, a testament to the endurance of the American experiment in the face of a brutal violation of the public trust. The mystery of Watergate was moving toward its final act, as the black files of the presidency were forced open by the highest authority in the land, proving that the truth is the only thing that can truly conquer power. This narrative is a vital reminder of why the separation of powers is the most essential piece of the American legend, a shield for the people against the dominance of the elite. The stage was now set for the tapes to speak, and the world was ready to listen to the shocking facts that would finally bring the empire to its knees. The date was August 5, 1974, a day when the scorching summer sun over Washington, D.C. seemed to strip away the last remnants of the navy blue authority that had once shielded the Nixon administration, exposing the brutal truth of a presidency in its final agonizing death throes. Following the unanimous Supreme Court ruling, the White House had been forced to surrender the black files of the Oval Office, the tapes that contained the undisclosed secrets of a secret war against the American people. Among these recordings was a single, devastating conversation from June 23, 1972, just 6 days after the Watergate break-in, which would become legendary as the smoking gun tape. This was the missing link that would finally decode the mystery of Richard Nixon's personal involvement in the cover-up, a shocking truth that would shatter the recreated reality his team had spent 2 years building. The transcript of this tape was a bombshell that destroyed the empire of lies. It recorded Nixon explicitly ordering H.R. Haldeman to have the CIA block the FBI's investigation into the break-in under the false guise of national security. This was the art of war used to subvert justice, a taboo violation of the presidential oath that proved the president had been a co-conspirator from the very beginning. As the smoking gun was revealed to the public, the atmosphere in the White House transitioned from a fortress of dominance to a cold blue courtroom of inevitable defeat. Even Nixon's most loyal defenders, the elite circle who had stood by him through the Saturday night massacre and the Senate hearings, felt a sense of ngang as they realized they had been protecting a man who had lied to their faces for 784 days. The visual identity of this moment is defined by high contrast and cinematic lighting. Nixon, with a stern, determined face that was now etched with the lines of profound exhaustion and shock, staring into the dark brown shadows of an empty Oval Office. He was no longer the master of a global empire. He was a man cornered by his own words, a prisoner of the very bugging technology he had used to ensure his legacy. The shocking facts contained in the June 23 tape made impeachment not just a possibility, but an absolute certainty. Did you know that when Nixon's own lawyers first read the transcript of the smoking gun, they realized their case was ancient history and that the president had essentially committed political suicide on tape? On the evening of August 7, 1974, a delegation of Republican leaders, led by the legendary Barry Goldwater, visited the White House to deliver a final warning. Nixon had no support left in the Senate and would surely be convicted if he chose to fight. This was the brutal Truth of a leader who had lost the trust of his own party, a human drama where the pursuit of absolute power had resulted in absolute isolation. The next night, August 8, 1974, the nation watched in a state of astonishment as Richard Nixon sat before the television cameras in a Navy suit, his confident smile replaced by a tense, dramatic expression. In a speech that would become a cornerstone of American hidden history, he announced his decision to resign, stating, "I shall resign the presidency, effective at noon tomorrow." He was the first and only president in the history of the United States to do so, a legendary fall from grace that left the world in shock. The smoking gun had ended the mystery, providing the essential evidence that no amount of hush money or political sabotage could bury. The ordinary American worker, watching from their living room, saw the end of a saga that had nearly destroyed the nation's faith in its own government. The final morning, August 9, 1974, was captured in cinematic lighting as Nixon walked across the South Lawn to the presidential helicopter, Executive One. In one last, defiant gesture that has become a legend of its own, he stood at the top of the stairs and raised both hands in a V for victory sign, a bizarre and dramatic contrast to the reality of his departure. The deep red drama of the Watergate scandal had reached its climax, and the empire of the Nixon era was officially over. This true story of the fall is a warning for all time about the dangers of paranoia and the inevitable collapse of any system built on a web of deceit. The missing tapes had been decoded, the black files were open, and the brutal truth had finally set the nation on a path toward a painful but necessary healing. As the helicopter lifted off, carrying the disgraced leader away from the White House background, the gold of the presidency seemed to dim, leaving behind a legacy of systemic distrust that would haunt the American soul for decades. The smoking gun was the ultimate mystery solver, the key that unlocked the forbidden truth of how close the Republic had come to the brink. This narrative of the fall is not just about one man. It is about the power of the law to hold even the most dominant figures accountable. An essential chapter in the hidden history of the United States that proves the truth is the only thing that can survive the light of transparency. The fall of Richard Nixon was a shocking facts-driven reality check for an entire generation, a forgotten tale of how quickly a leader can go from the pinnacle of power to the depths of disgrace when they abandon the parchment of the Constitution for the shadows of a secret war. The stage was now set for the aftermath, as a new president stepped into the light to try and mend a broken nation. As the rotor blades of Executive One faded into the distance, a heavy contemplative silence settled over the White House, marking the beginning of a new chapter in the American legend, one defined not by the gold of imperial power, but by the somber navy blue of a nation trying to find its moral compass once again. This is the final act of our hidden history, a true story of the scars left on the soul of a nation and the brutal truth of how Watergate transformed the American psyche forever. On August 9, 1974, Gerald Ford stood in the East Room, an ordinary American worker thrust into the pinnacle of dominance, and declared that our long national nightmare is over. But for many, the nightmare was just beginning to shift into a different, more cynical form of mystery. The most shocking facts of the aftermath emerged just 1 month later, when Ford issued a full, free, and absolute pardon to Richard Nixon for any crimes he may have committed against the United States. This was a bombshell that hit the public like a physical blow, a taboo violation of the perceived justice that Woodward, Bernstein, and the Senate had fought so hard to uncover. To some, it was an essential act of healing, a way to close the black files of the Nixon era and move the empire forward. To others, it was the final undisclosed secret of the conspiracy. Corrupt bargain that allowed the elite to escape the consequences of their secret war. The pardon left a permanent scar, a sense of Ngang that led to a systemic distrust of government that persists into the 21st century. We must rewind the tapes of cultural history to see how the very language of power changed. The suffix "gate" became a permanent piece of our political code, attached to every future scandal to signal a sense of hidden history and deep-seated corruption. Watergate didn't just bring down a president, it decoded the myth of the imperial presidency, exposing the shocking truth that the man in the Oval Office could move like an assassin against the very Constitution he was sworn to protect. The legacy of this era is found in the forgotten tales of the legislative reforms that followed: the War Powers Act, the Privacy Act, and the creation of the Federal Election Commission. All essential guardrails designed to prevent the return of absolute dominance. These were the legal ciphers intended to break the cycle of paranoia and surveillance that had defined the Nixon years. The visual identity of this aftermath is captured in the high contrast of the Ford era, the warm sunset of a new beginning clashing with the cold blue courtroom shadows of the trials of Nixon's top aides, many of whom traded their suits for prison uniforms. This is the brutal truth of the fall, that while the leader escaped, the foot soldiers of the empire paid the price in a legendary display of accountability. Did you know that Watergate remains the primary lens through which the American public views political power? A warning that curiosity and skepticism are the only weapons against the descent into tyranny. This narrative serves as a reminder that the light of transparency must be kept burning, for the shadows of the elite are always ready to reclaim the corridors of power. As we conclude this journey through the black files of the 1970s, we are left with a final mystery. Can a nation truly heal when the truth remains partially undisclosed? The legend of Watergate is not ancient history. It is a living warning, a true story that calls us to be vigilant, and to remember that the navy blue authority of the law must always prevail over the gold of personal ambition. The scars on the American soul are deep, but they are also the marks of a survivor. A republic that looked into the abyss of a secret war and chose to pull itself back toward the light. Thank you for joining Many Histories on this deep dive into the shadows of the Watergate scandal. If you found these shocking facts and hidden histories as gripping as we did, please hit the like button, share this video with fellow history buffs, and subscribe to our channel for more decoded truths about the American empire. Drop a comment below. Do you think Gerald Ford was right to pardon Nixon, or was it a brutal betrayal of justice? Stay curious, stay informed, and always question the official narrative, for the real story is often buried in the dark.